She thought she was just claiming a better seat on a crowded flight. A simple decision, one that many overlook. But what began as an entitled gesture would unravel into a shocking moment that left the entire cabin in silence. The man she dismissed wasn't just another passenger. He was someone with power she could never imagine. This story isn't about comfort, it's about the hidden cost of prejudice in plain sight. And when the truth finally surfaced, it left everyone asking, how far can arrogance go before reality strikes back? It was supposed to be another smooth day, the kind of day that spoke to years of hard work and discipline. James Carter had built a life many only dreamed of. As a black CEO in his mid-40s, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought for every inch of success. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege. His childhood was spent in a modest neighborhood where opportunity was scarce and doubt was constant. But through determination, sleepless nights, and an unshakable vision, he climbed from the bottom to the very top of his industry. James wasn't just successful, he was respected. He owned an airline, a company that had started as a small regional carrier and grown into a nationally recognized brand. His name didn't always appear in the headlines, and he preferred it that way. What mattered to him was creating jobs, building trust, and giving back to communities that often felt forgotten. He knew what it meant to be overlooked. He knew what it felt like to be judged before anyone even knew his story. Travel was second nature to him. Airports, boardrooms, late-night flights, these weren't disruptions but part of the rhythm of his life. He had grown accustomed to moving through spaces where he didn't quite fit the stereotype of what others expected a CEO to look like. The polished suit, the sharp mind, the commanding presence, all of it seemed to vanish in the eyes of strangers who saw only his skin. And while he had learned to keep his composure, those quiet moments of dismissal never lost their sting. On this particular day, James was traveling alone. It was a simple flight, one of countless journeys he had made before. No entourage, no assistants, just him, his briefcase, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was heading home after sealing an important business deal. He boarded early, nodding politely to the flight crew, moving with the kind of ease that came from familiarity with the process. To him, flying wasn't glamorous anymore, it was routine. But routine, as he was about to discover, can break in an instant. The cabin was filling up quickly, passengers shuffling down the aisle with bags tugging at their arms, looking for seats, adjusting luggage, and exchanging weary glances. Among them was a woman who carried herself with visible impatience. Dressed in designer clothes, she moved with the kind of entitlement that demanded space without ever asking for it. She glanced around the cabin as though every seat should cater to her comfort. When her eyes landed on James, already settled in his assigned place, something flickered across her face, a flash of irritation, as if the sight of him there disrupted the picture she had painted of herself in first class. James didn't notice at first. He was reviewing notes on his tablet, his mind half on work, half on the thought of home. But small moments were already beginning to take shape, moments that would soon collide into something far larger than a simple misunderstanding. For now, though, everything was calm. The steady hum of passengers finding their seats, the overhead bins closing one by one, the flight attendants offering polite reminders. It was all so ordinary, so familiar. And yet, beneath that ordinary scene, tension was quietly building. Not the kind of tension passengers feel before turbulence, but something deeper, more personal. A storm born not from weather, but from judgment. It lingered unseen, waiting for its moment to erupt. James had lived long enough to know that prejudice often revealed itself in the most unexpected places, in boardrooms, in restaurants, on sidewalks. But on this day, at 30,000 feet in the air, he was about to face it in a way that would leave the entire cabin silent. This was more than a flight. It was about to become a mirror, reflecting truths many still refused to see. James sat quietly, adjusting the papers in his briefcase as the cabin filled. He had no idea his simple act of taking his rightful seat was about to ignite a storm. The woman who had eyed him earlier was now standing directly over him. Passengers nearby began shifting uncomfortably, sensing something was brewing. She leaned closer, her voice sharp but loud enough for others to hear. She insisted that he must be mistaken, that this was her seat. The entitlement in her tone cut through the air, as if she couldn't fathom the possibility that a black man in a tailored suit could belong in first class. James kept his composure. He had dealt with subtle slights before doors closed in his face. Assumptions whispered under breath. But this wasn't whispered. This was public. The kind of moment that forced strangers to watch and silently decide where they stood. He calmly showed her his boarding pass. His name, his seat number printed clearly. Facts that should have ended the discussion. But instead, her expression hardened, her voice rising. She waved her own ticket, insisting again that he didn't belong there. The cabin grew quieter. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned. The hum of ordinary boarding was replaced by the electric tension of confrontation. A flight attendant hurried over, attempting to mediate. The woman's complaint was simple but laced with venom. "He's in my seat." She said it as though James himself was the problem, not the numbers printed on paper. The attendant checked both tickets, her face tightening when she realized the truth. The woman's ticket was for the row behind close, but not the same. A simple mistake, one that most people would laugh off. But this wasn't about a mistake. It was about perception. Instead of apologizing, the woman scoffed. She crossed her arms, glaring down at James as though he had stolen something from her. The silence in the cabin pressed heavier. James could feel the weight of every pair of eyes, some sympathetic, some curious, and some quietly agreeing with her indignation. The flight attendant asked the woman to take her assigned seat. That should have ended it. But she refused. She demanded to be moved elsewhere. She muttered about standards, about comfort, her words slipping into phrases that carried an unmistakable sting. She never said the word directly, but everyone knew what she meant. James wasn't the image she expected to see in this section of the plane. James sat still, his posture unshaken, though inside, the familiar ache of humiliation burned. He had faced this too many times in hotel lobbies where people assumed he wasn't a guest, in boardrooms where others mistook him for the help. And now, here again, at 30,000 feet, his dignity was being challenged in front of strangers. The minutes dragged. The woman raised her voice again, demanding a supervisor, threatening to report the airline for allowing this kind of mix-up. Her words echoed across the cabin. Passengers whispered. Some pulled out their phones recording. James knew what those videos could capture. Not just a quarrel over a seat, but a reflection of something deeper, uglier. The captain had not yet closed the door. Delay warnings rippled through the crew. This was no longer just a small incident, it was threatening the entire flight. And through it all, James stayed calm, his silence more powerful than any argument. But then came the moment that made the air turn heavy. The woman leaned in close enough for only a few rows to hear, her voice lowered but dripping with venom. She told James he should know his place. Gasps broke out. A couple of passengers shifted uncomfortably, others pretended not to hear. The flight attendant froze, caught between duty and disbelief. James felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a sadness that had followed him his entire life. No matter his success, no matter the empire he had built, some people would always try to reduce him to less. And yet, she still didn't know who she was speaking to, because James Carter wasn't just another passenger in first class. He wasn't a man who had lucked into his seat. He was the man who owned the airline she was flying on, but he wasn't ready to reveal that, not yet. The cabin was holding its breath, caught between outrage and silence. And as the confrontation teetered on the edge of escalation, the question loomed over everyone. How much further would she go before the truth shattered her illusion? The tension inside the cabin was unbearable. What had started as a simple seat dispute had spiraled into something darker, something raw. The woman's voice was now sharp enough to cut through the hum of the engines. She demanded to be moved, demanded that standards be upheld, her words echoing with venom the crew could no longer disguise. Passengers shifted uneasily, caught between wanting to intervene and fearing the confrontation would turn uglier. James sat still, his hands folded, his breathing measured. On the outside, he looked calm. On the inside, He was fighting the familiar storm of emotions: anger, sadness, exhaustion. Every fiber of his being wanted to stand and speak, to shatter her arrogance with truth. But he knew something she didn't. Sometimes silence exposes a person louder than words ever could. The flight attendant tried once more, her voice firmer this time, instructing the woman to take her assigned seat. But instead of backing down, the woman escalated. She shouted across the cabin, pointing directly at James, accusing him of taking what isn't his. Phones rose higher, cameras rolling. A child in the row ahead began to cry, frightened by the shouting. The orderly rhythm of boarding had dissolved into chaos, all centered on a single man sitting exactly where he was supposed to be. Then came the words that froze the air. "Men like him don't belong here." Gasps, sharp inhales. A few people muttered in disbelief. The mask was gone, the pretense stripped away. It was no longer about a ticket, or a row, or even comfort. It was about race spoken aloud, undeniable. James felt the sting pierce deeper than any insult. Decades of hard work, every barrier he had broken, every glass ceiling he had shattered, reduced in an instant by a stranger who saw only his skin. His chest tightened, not out of fear, but from the weight of recognition. This was not new. This was centuries old. And now, here it was again, playing out in real time, in front of dozens of witnesses, 30,000 feet above the ground. The crew threatened to remove the woman if she refused to comply. Her face flushed with rage. She screamed about rights, about unfair treatment, twisting the narrative as though she were the victim. James sat silently, letting the scene unravel. He had learned long ago that injustice often exposed itself when given enough rope, and she was unraveling with every word, every bitter glare. But then, just when it seemed the situation couldn't stretch any further, James stood. Slowly, deliberately. The cabin hushed instantly. Cameras focused tighter. Every eye locked on him. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his sleek black wallet, and unfolded a card embossed with the airline's logo. He held it steady, not for her alone, but for everyone watching. The gold lettering glimmered under the cabin lights. James Carter, Chief Executive Officer. The woman blinked, confusion washing over her face. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A man near the back whispered, "He owns the airline." Another gasped audibly. The cameras kept recording, catching every flicker of realization. For the first time since the argument began, the woman faltered. Her shoulders sagged, her mouth opened, but no words came. The power she had wielded with such entitlement dissolved into silence. The seat she claimed, the superiority she clung to, it all crumbled in the presence of truth. James didn't need to say anything. His silence was enough. His presence, his dignity, his truth standing against her prejudice was louder than any confrontation could have been. The cabin remained hushed, the weight of the reveal settling over everyone like a tidal wave. And as James calmly sat back down, sliding his card away, one thought echoed in the minds of every passenger. What happens when the person you try to diminish is the very one who holds the power you could never imagine? The cabin never felt the same after that moment. The reveal hung in the air, undeniable, unforgettable. The woman who had been so loud just minutes earlier now sat in silence, her face flushed with the heavy sting of humiliation. The crew escorted her to her assigned seat, and she shrank back into the row behind him, no longer demanding comfort, no longer commanding the space. But for James, it wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was exhaustion. He hadn't wanted to prove himself. He hadn't wanted to expose her. All he had wanted was a quiet flight home. Instead, he was forced once again to remind the world that dignity is not something to be earned with titles or wealth, but something every human being deserves by default. The other passengers sat with their own thoughts. Some avoided his gaze, ashamed of their silence. Others offered small nods of respect, as if trying to apologize without words. A few, still clutching their phones, knew they had captured something far bigger than a viral video. They had captured a mirror, a reflection of a society where prejudice can ignite in the most ordinary of places, even 30,000 feet in the sky. When the plane finally touched down, James gathered his things and stepped into the aisle with the same calm composure he had shown all along. He didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. The weight of her actions, the sting of her words, and the truth of who he was would linger with her long after the flight was over. For James, this was just another chapter in a lifetime of moments where he had to rise above. And that's the tragedy of it. No matter how high he climbed, no matter how much he achieved, the shadow of racism followed him. It waited for him in boardrooms, in hotels, in neighborhoods, and even in the seat of his own airline. Success couldn't shield him. Power couldn't protect him, because racism doesn't stop to ask about titles. It doesn't pause to check our sums or bank accounts. It strikes at the surface, at what it sees, reducing a lifetime of struggle, sacrifice, and triumph into a single false judgment. And that is why this story matters. Because James's experience isn't isolated. It's a thread in a much larger fabric, one woven through centuries of injustice, humiliation, and survival. Think about it. If a man who owns an airline can still be told he doesn't belong in first class, what does that mean for those without wealth, without influence, without power? How many times are voices silenced, opportunities stolen, dignity stripped away without an audience, without a camera, without the world ever knowing? This flight wasn't just about one woman and one man. It was about a society still wrestling with the disease of prejudice, a disease that hides behind politeness until it no longer can, a disease that infects spaces we all share: schools, streets, workplaces, even airplanes. James's silence spoke louder than her rage. His dignity outshone her arrogance. And in that moment, the roles flipped. She became the spectacle, and he became the lesson. But here's the truth. The burden should not always fall on those targeted to teach that lesson. It shouldn't take a CEO's title to command respect. It shouldn't take power to prove worth. Humanity alone should be enough. So as you sit with this story, ask yourself, how many more flights, how many more neighborhoods, how many more lives will be disrupted before we truly confront the prejudice that hides in plain sight? How many more humiliations will it take before dignity is given, not demanded? The next time you see injustice, the next time you witness arrogance dressed as entitlement, remember this flight. Remember James. And remember that silence, in the face of prejudice, always speaks, but it's your choice whether it speaks for justice or against it. Because in the end, the question isn't what James endured. The question is, what will you do when it happens in front of you?